Hello, you're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, consumers are left with a bill of billions by some companies exploiting the need to fill gaps in the electricity supply. Madagascar braces for an approaching tropical cyclone as it struggles to recover from flooding and landslides last month. The Beijing Winter Olympics get started, claiming to be the first carbon-neutral games. Questions over the impact on the environment remain. Hello and welcome to the UK's only climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with solutions. Well, while consumers are still taking in the news that they will be paying hundreds of pounds more on their energy bills from April, it's also emerged that households are faced with a record £2.5 billion bill spent in 2021 to plug gaps in Britain's electricity supply. Coal and gas-fired power stations are often called on to supply extra electricity when renewable sources like wind and solar are not providing enough for the national grid. The industry is now concerned that some companies could be exploiting that situation to make additional profits. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, explains.
This is the Electricity National Control Centre. The display shows every power generator, high voltage line and connection on Great Britain's grid. Keeping a steady flow of electricity is a constant balancing act, and in recent months, a very expensive one. Looking at the screen, you can see nearly half our electricity right now is coming from wind power, with a bit of nuclear and gas making up the rest. But on less windy days, engineers here have to buy in extra electricity to fill gaps in the electricity supply. Now, normally that costs around £2 million a day, but recently the cost of doing that have been rising exponentially. Balancing the electricity grid cost consumers £2.6 billion in 2021. That's around £860 million more than in 2020, a 48% rise on an already record year. And just last Monday, we saw the third most expensive day ever, just under £41 million extra to plug the gap.
We have seen days that have cost between 30 and 65 million in the
last... In a single day?
In a single day in the last few months. So the top 10 most expensive days we've ever seen in the balancing mechanism have all occurred since September last year. So we are talking orders of magnitude above what we're used to.
The surge in cost is partly due to the gas price, but on tight days, National Grid has to ask plants that are standing idle to start generating. That includes ageing coal-powered plants, which are expensive to fire up. The concern in the industry is that other cheaper-to-run gas-fired stations are pricing themselves as high as coal and making windfall profits on windless days.
Pricing seems very high compared to normal, and what we need to understand is how much of that is related to the price of gas, given the international gas crisis, and how much of it is due to potential bad behaviour from generators who, quite frankly, are taking the mick in order to make excessive profits.
Concerned about the trend, energy regulator Ofgem has written to generators, and National Grid has launched a review into market behaviour.
They can bid in whatever price that they think is appropriate or whatever price they feel that the market will bear. So it is a competitive market. We wanted to make sure that the rules and the mechanisms of that balancing market were delivering competitive outcomes for consumers.
The review is expected to take another month or two, but gas prices are likely to remain high as more renewables continue to plug into the grid. In future, battery storage, new nuclear plants or hydrogen power could fill the gaps on windless, gloomy days. But until then, regulators will have to keep a close eye on our rapidly changing electricity market. Tom Clark, Sky News.
Madagascar, already recovering from a devastating tropical storm, is now bracing for an approaching cyclone. Its Department of Meteorology has forecast the storm will hit the east coast on Saturday, having already killed at least one person in Mauritius and caused widespread power cuts along its path. Well, Storm Anna struck Madagascar last month, triggering floods and landslides. You can see here where the storm passed through the country. Now the island is bracing for a second extreme weather event, a Category 4 cyclone. Tropical cyclone Batsirai is on course to strike Madagascar this weekend, and meteorologists are warning the 100-mile-an-hour sustained winds will make it the strongest storm to hit the country in 4 years. Sky's John Sparks has the latest.
This storm has already skirted the islands of Mauritius and Reunion, where high winds knock down electricity pylons, causing widespread power cuts. According to the Madagascar Weather Service, Batsirai is expected to make landfall near the town of Mahanoro, and wind speeds of over 200 kilometers an hour are possible. The equivalent, they say, of a Category 3 or potentially a Category 4 hurricane. They are also warning about torrential rains, up to 600 millimeters, which can cause all sorts of problems like extensive building damage, widespread flooding, and landslides. It's a particularly difficult period for Madagascar. Another major weather system, Cyclone Anna, passed over the island just 2 weeks ago, claiming the lives of 58 and making 130,000 people homeless. The authorities declared a state of national disaster after fields and rivers were inundated by floodwaters. Even low-lying parts of the capital and Antananarivo were badly affected. The region is certainly vulnerable as the number and intensity of these storms increase. And that is a direct product, say experts, of climate change, with temperatures on land and sea rising at an alarming rate.
Well, now for a look at some of the other climate news making headlines today. The Transport Committee is warning that the tax breaks driving the popularity in electric and hybrid car sales could create a £35 billion loss for motoring funds. The government's aiming to ban the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030, but there have been no plans to supplement the tax revenue they generate.
If the government doesn't take immediate steps to decide what its preferred option is to fix this £35 billion black hole, then you may end up with a whole patchwork of local charging zones, and it will be impossible to put a national charging policy in place. And if that's the case, then where is this 4% of the entire tax take going to come from? What's going to fund not just the roads, but also the schools and hospitals, which are currently funded by motorists?
Poland has paid €45 million to the Czech Republic to settle a long-running dispute to expand the Turów coal mine on the border between the two countries. Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala was fighting for the environmental rights of his country, claiming the mine sucks up the underground water resources of their neighbouring villages. The dispute reached the Court of Justice of the European Union before they agreed compensation for infrastructure upgrades and other environmental safeguards. The EU Commissioner for the Environment says the health of the world's oceans must be a key priority in 2022. Virginijus Sinkevicius says an ambitious agreement is needed, protecting biodiversity and starting negotiations to tackle the global crisis of plastic pollution, especially at sea. At a UN news conference, he said precious time to save nature and the oceans has been lost due to the pandemic. And an Indian village is banking on tree mortgages in a bid to go carbon neutral by 2025 and boost the local economy. Kerala's farmers face ailing business, droughts and flooding. But in the village of Minangadi, farmers who plant and look after trees can mortgage them for a 10-year interest-free loan from the council. Those loans only have to be paid back if any of the trees are cut down. Now, the Beijing Winter Olympics kicked off today and they are being heralded as the first ever carbon-neutral games. But environmental concerns remain, as they will also be the first to rely on almost 100% artificial snow, with hundreds of generators at the venue operating around the clock for more than 2 months. Also causing concern are the ice rinks, most of which are powered by potent greenhouse gases. Joining me now is Tim Kellison, who's an Associate Professor of Sports Administration at Georgia State University. Lovely to speak to you, Tim. Beijing says these are going to be carbon-neutral games, the first. How is that feasible, given that they're using 100% artificial snow?
Yeah, well, so much of this relies on, as previous Olympics have claimed to be carbon neutral, this one's getting much closer, but a lot of reliance on offsetting, which has been the case for quite some time. I think what we're seeing different with this particular games is that they're much less reliant on those offsetting devices and tools. So I think what we're seeing with Beijing is a preview of what's to come, not just with moving closer to carbon neutrality, but also this reliance on artificial snow.
Are you surprised that this is coming from China, which certainly at COP didn't show itself to be, at the forefront of the climate change movement?
I'm not surprised. Mostly, yes, the political and the geopolitical structures and everything that goes on in China is certainly concerning, particularly with the some calls for greater leadership from all countries, including my own. But because the Olympic and Paralympic Games are the premier sporting event in the world, all eyes will be on China. And this is where a country can signal its leadership in lots of different ways, including in sustainability.
And what about more generally, as climate change takes hold, places that normally saw lots of snow suddenly are seeing less snow. Could this be an end for winter sports or traditional winter sports?
Yeah, well, I think it depends on how you define traditional. I don't see the Winter Olympics going away, but I do think that Beijing is a good indicator and a good test run of how future Olympics will be because of...
Sorry to interrupt you, Tim, but just what about actual ski resorts? So I'm thinking of, the Alps or, of course, in Canada or in the US.
Yeah, well, certainly. So the Olympics will always be able to put on events like this. They can rely and they can pay for artificial snowmaking. But if you listen to the athletes talking about, their own experiences on the slopes, they're not just thinking about themselves, they're thinking about future generations and the health of outdoor and winter and snow sports in the future. So there is a serious concern about the impact that climate change is having on the ability of local resorts or just general mountain slopes keeping maintaining high levels of participation, which is necessary for the health of the sport and health of folks as well.
Absolutely, Tim. Great to get your thoughts. Thanks so much, Tim Kellison there from Georgia State University. Well, finding replacements for plastics in all walks of life will reduce both pollution and our reliance on the petrochemicals needed for production. In the latest of our series of climate diaries, we hear from Notpla, a company making sustainable packaging from seaweed.
Notpla is a sustainable packaging startup. We make alternative materials out of seaweed and plants. We hope to replace single-use plastics and other non-sustainable materials with our products in the coming years. You might not know, but a plastic bottle for water, a usual 500ml one, uses about half a cup of oil to make it and 8 litres of water. This is a massive sustainability issue. Currently, we have our original product, the OHO, which is a flexible packaging for liquids that is in fact also edible. And that is used at events and marathons. So you might have seen it at the London Marathon, filled with Lucozade, and we can also fill it with water or other drinks. When you get a takeaway currently, you might not realise that that very nice looking brown paper box actually has thin plastic lining inside it, and we have replaced that with our material, which makes that box both biodegradable but also recyclable. Seaweed is a fantastic material. It grows in the ocean, so it doesn't require fresh water to grow, and it doesn't compete with food crops for arable land. Packaging has a huge impact in terms of climate change, and if we can reduce the amount of carbon released in the manufacture of packaging, then fantastic.
Amazing stuff. Well, do stay with us, because coming up on the Daily Climate Show, I will be joined by the economist Vicky Price and a climate columnist for The Independent, Donica McCarthy. We will be discussing solutions to the eye-watering costs of balancing our national electricity grid and to that potential black hole in public finances left by the switch to electric vehicles. Stay with us. Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're going to get straight into discussing the climate issues of the day with the economist Vicky Price and climate columnist for The Independent, Donica McCarthy. Thanks very much to both of you for being with us. Donica, I'd like to start with you. The baseload, as we heard earlier in the programme, isn't being met by renewables at the moment. It's going to get more expensive to fill that gap using oil and gas. So how should we be meeting our energy demands?
Well, what we're looking at here is a failure by the Treasury to invest in renewable baseload over the last 10 years and in insulation. So it's actually left householders vulnerable to exploitation by the fossil fuel industry at the moment. And secondly, it's left the national grid vulnerable to blackmail by the fossil fuel industry. At the moment, wind electricity is now costing £40 per megawatt. It's £200 for gas megawatts. So what we need to be doing is investing in green hydrogen plants, tidal power and storage. The failure to invest in these type of electricity storage over the last 10 years have left us vulnerable to this exploitation. However, there is some good news. Because actually wind is now so cheap, it's actually going to save households $750 million this year, and an estimated, according to SSE, over the next 5 years, something like £9 billion going back to consumers because of the expansion in wind energy.
That's interesting, because you're saying that there is still the scope for renewables to fill that gap. Vicky Price, would you agree there, or do you think we do need to fall back on the traditional fossil fuels?
Well, the problem is going to take quite some time for renewables to really fill the gap completely. I mean, there have been days recently where renewables were not making up a very large part of the electricity that was being used. So with gas, perhaps accounting for over half of what we were using. So that's a serious problem. So you need storage, and that storage is difficult to come by. I agree that we haven't invested enough in it. There are all sorts of ways in which renewables can be stored, but they cost, and they require quite a lot of technologies which for some reason we haven't necessarily invested in, but also they require some rather big grid batteries. And again, the investment needs to go in there. But until that happens, we are going to be relying quite significantly on those gas-fired power stations, sometimes even coal-fired power stations, to ensure that at least electricity is not interrupted. Because unfortunately what happens with renewables is that they're very intermittent. You can suddenly have no wind and the sun will not shine. What do you do then?
I mean, Donica, what do you make of that? Do you think, for you, do you think this could actually be an opportunity for us to move towards investment in renewables? But even more widely on this idea of the baseload, do we need such a high baseload?
Very good question. I mean, in my job as an eco-auditor, I visit businesses, charities, homes, where we are heating, lighting and cooling empty rooms, empty spaces. What we really need to question, as you rightly raise, is why have we such a high baseload? Nobody talks about that. The actual cost in terms of putting in infrastructure to cover the base load is extraordinarily expensive in terms of infrastructure investment. However, every kilowatt of electricity not used is free and save us all. So what I think we need to be doing is a major program of energy efficiency, not just in infrastructure and in insulation, but actually in practice. We need to train the public and our businesses how to use energy efficiently. We must stop leaving the air conditioning and heating on overnight in our homes, in our businesses, and in our tower blocks.
How could we do that? Do you have any sort of practical solutions as to how we could better manage that?
Well, a timer. I've gone to charities and they've left the heating on all week, all night, all weekend, and just a simple timer can cut their carbon emissions for heating by around 40 to 50%. A simple timer can actually be really effective. And I would ask any viewer who's actually at work to make sure the timer and temperature for their operation is set correctly, and please make sure they're not air conditioning and heating empty spaces.
Vicky, I wonder what you make of what Donica just said. Do you think that's enough to tackle the root cause, or is it simply not good? It's just a sticking plaster at this stage?
I think energy efficiency is key. There's no doubt about that. It's key for homes, it's key for buildings. And it's absolutely true that when buildings are unoccupied, one shouldn't leave all these things on. But however, we do have a very, very old housing stock, and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of money to improve that insulation. So we've got a long way to go. I'm afraid we're going to be relying on that base load we've been talking about for quite some time.
I absolutely agree. I think we will be talking about that for quite some time, so we will leave it for this evening and move on to our second topic with our two guests, which is, of course, as the country shifts from petrol and diesel cars to electric vehicles, the tax income for the Treasury will reduce. Less car tax and less duty paid on fuel. That makes a £35 billion hole to fill. That's according to the MP's Transport Committee. The committee says filling that gap is something the government needs to grapple with, and fast. Well, let's go back to our guests. And Vicky, I'd like to start with you on this one. Do you think we need to move to a European model when it comes to roads? I'm thinking about tolls for road users, for example.
Well, remember, the tools that they've got is mainly on motorways. And not all countries have that either. So it varies from place to place. What I think the committee is thinking of is, in fact, charging by the mile, possibly in towns as well. We already have, of course, a congestion charge and other things that people have to pay when they get into the centre of towns. But of course, it doesn't generally apply much to electric vehicles, or at least there are all sorts of exemptions out there. The interesting thing is that indeed there is a lot of money which is being collected by fuel duty, and of course VAT on petrol as well, and then you add to that the tax that you pay to just have a car, and indeed there will be a 35 billion hole, but only about 7 billion of that goes to improving the road. So basically what drivers are doing, and I don't know why drivers have to pay for this, they're paying for a lot else that goes on in the economy. There is no real reason for that. If the government wants to get revenue to pay for other things like schools and the general sort of welfare system that we have, then it should do something different and redistribute, a tax take in a different way, raise income tax if necessary.
That's very interesting. I mean, Donica, what do you make of this idea that electric vehicles should not be taxed? Do you think that's enough to incentivise all of us to get an electric vehicle, and is that the right strategy?
It's good strategy whilst we're encouraging the transition, but once we've actually achieved the transition, then it makes sense to introduce road charging. We cannot just switch all our fleet over to electric vehicles, because the amount of electricity required is mind-boggling, and secondly, we need to improve the economies of our towns and cities. We need to tackle congestion, we need to tackle pollution, and we need to tackle safety. And what road charging does, it differentiates between congested cities and rural streets for people living in rural areas. The vast majority of the public lives in urban areas, and so road charging really makes sense there to discourage usage of cars and to move people to more healthy styles of cycling, walking, and using public transport. It's not the committee is right to be looking forward and to be planning for when we're reducing the tax take from fossil fuel cars. However, we must not think that we can just switch over to electricity and that solves all our problems. Because, for example, just the tyres alone, we're an estimate of something like 12 times the size of Wales will be felled in rainforests to produce the rubber for electric vehicles and fossil fuel vehicles. So we need to reduce the number of cars as well as switch the essential vehicles over to electricity.
OK. Vicky, just to go back to your point you made earlier as well, who do you think should be paying for the upkeep of the road? Should it be just the diesel and the petrol guzzling cars, or should other people using those roads be paying for them as well?
But the other people, of course, include cyclists, include pedestrians, and of course they also have something to benefit from if the roads are kept to the standard that should be kept. Potholes affect poor cyclists quite considerably. So, yeah, I think the general population, in other words, needs to pay for this. But we should not confuse the type of paying per mile, which is really more for congestion, to anything we charge motorists for paying for general upkeep of everything else in the economy. I think everyone who uses the roads needs to pay something for them, and I think that should be part of the general taxation system.
Donica, in a word, quickly, I know you're a cyclist. Would you be happy to pay for the use of the roads?
Well, we have to remember what cars are currently paying. They're not paying road tax, they're paying pollution tax. And actually what that is to counter what drivers need to pay for is the damage that they're doing to society, as well as the actual right to use the road. And so that's why we have to continue charging road drivers taxes and not charge pedestrians or cyclists taxes, because it's what we want to encourage for a safer, healthier community.
Donica, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We're all out of time. Great to hear from both of you. Donica McCarthy and Vicky Price, thank you. And before we go, remember, you can download ClimateCast wherever you get your podcasts. This week, Anna and Katerina are getting glitzy. They're talking cli-fi. That's right, climate fiction. They'll be hearing from the producer of Amazon's show The Expanse and from Professor Michael Mann, friend to this show and apparently the inspiration behind Leonardo DiCaprio's character in the Netflix hit Don't Look Up. Well, thanks very much for watching. We will see you next time.